Hello and welcome. I'm very happy to see you all to our first international talk today. My name is Marlene Knobloch. I'm staff writer at the culture section at die ZEIT. And I am very excited to present today Lea Ypi. She is a philosopher, writer, scientist, born 1979 in Albania, which was back then still under a brutal dictatorship. Ypi studied philosophy and literature in Rome and Florence. Her research and lectures led her to Paris, to Oxford, to Stanford, and to Frankfurt am Main. Yes. She's a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics, and she's the author of the bestseller Frei, which is called in German Frei, erwachsen werden am Ende der Geschichte, which was a huge success. It got translated into 30 languages. And today we're going to talk about indignity. The German translation is Aufrecht, Überleben im Zeitalter der Extreme. And yes, a warm applause for Lea Ypi. Welcome. Thank you. So your new book is again following in an astonishing change of genres. We're going to talk about it probably later. The history of your family, and in the center is your grandmother, Marlene Ypi, and she kind of lived through very, very different kind of political systems: the Ottoman Empire, the fascist regime in Albania, the dictatorship under Hoxha in Albania, and then capitalism. So very exciting times. And the book starts with a photo that you discover. Can you tell us about this photo on Facebook it was, and why this is the start of your book? And did you already had an idea that you're going to write a book when you discovered this photograph on Facebook?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to all of you. It's my first time in the Frankfurt Book Fair, though not in Frankfurt, so it's very exciting to be here. Yeah, the story started when someone I knew texted me to say that my grandmother had become viral on Facebook. And my grandmother, long dead, so 2006 is when she passed away. And it was the aftermath of the reception of my other book, Frei. There was a photo of her that I had never seen before on the Facebook wall of someone I had also never met before and also never heard the name of. And the photo depicted her and my grandfather as young people in a ski resort. And I could tell from the skis in the background and from the age and from the stories that I knew that this would have been taken during her honeymoon in the Italian Dolomites in the winter of 1941. The photo was new to me because she had told me that all the records from her youth had disappeared when the communists confiscated all her property at the point in which they arrested my grandfather after the end of World War II, when the communists came to power in Albania. And she'd always said that this was the happiest time of her life, and I'd always wondered about this episode in particular because I'd also wondered what kind of person can be the happiest person in the world in the winter of 1941. But it was a kind of period that was always wrapped in mystery, and so I had wondered about her youth and her life and what preceded her being in the same system as me, which was communism, having lived through these other systems. What sparked the curiosity and what I wanted to follow through were the comments on Facebook, which came from strangers who were alleging that she had been a communist spy, and some people were saying she'd been a fascist spy. Some people said she'd been both. So on doing further research, I discovered that this photo came from the archive of the Albanian former Secret Service, where not just her youth photos would be held, but also all the surveillance reports of the spies who filed reports on her and who had been following her throughout her life. And so, in part, as a response to these very derogatory comments of someone that I was very attached to, but long dead, in part because she'd always talked about dignity and the importance of keeping dignity in times of crisis and of surviving through dignity. And the fact that she wasn't there to somehow respond to these trolls and to shape her legacy or to talk about it made me want to then follow this story and try and find out the truth about both this period of her life and also write the story in a way that would vindicate the kind of dignity that she had that she could no longer vindicate herself.
So were you afraid there was something hidden, that your grandmother would probably hid something through all her life that could now bring indignity after her death even?
Yeah, I was. In fact, I was so afraid that when I filed the request, you had a choice between filing a request as a family member, and that would have been free. The application was free of charge. And filing the request as a researcher, which you had to pay for, but created a kind of distance between you and the person that you're researching. And so I filed the request as a researcher because I thought that the money that you save from the application form is nothing compared to the burden that you have to bear if you discover something horrible about someone that you've been very close to. And of course, I knew a lot of stories from friends who had been doing the same with communist archives and discovered that they went there thinking that they would find a victim. But what they found was a collaborator of, their father had spied on their best friend, or their uncle had spied on their wife. So it was I knew that there was a lot of stories buried in this kind of archive that you might uncover, and that would completely change not just your relationship to the person that is now no longer there, but actually your own sense of identity.
Did you think that this research in the archives really helped you to find answers on these questions?
Actually, they helped me find better questions, I think, is the short way of putting it. Because the one thing about the archive, you go there, especially if you're in a post-communist society, where you go there, and indeed all societies that are troubled by these questions of historical injustice and victims and reconciliation, is that you go to the archive thinking that you'll find the truth, and the truth will help you reconcile with the past of your family and your family members. But soon you discover that actually there is only a truth to find if you can trust the mechanisms that reproduce the truth for you, that hand it over to you. And the first thing you notice when you go to this archive, which is, first of all, in a military complex, so you enter this military garrison and people with guns are defending it, and it's quite suggestive. Then you go there and you realize you don't actually ever get to see the originals, because the originals are buried underground and you get given the PDFs. And even the employees of the archive can't go to the archive themselves. They have to go in pairs, and they go wearing gloves for fear of manipulation. And this is all because these questions around the archive are such live historical issues that there's always a worry that someone in the present might be affected by what you find there. But then you also discover that actually the archives contain a lot of mistakes. And the one thing that I encountered very soon was a death certificate of my grandmother in 1953. And now I lived with my grandmother until I was 25, and I was not born in 1953, and I was not 25 in 1953. So there was clearly some issue there, and on doing further research, I discovered that actually this was very common, because sometimes people would insert fake information to save family members if they have some contact high up in the party, or sometimes the spies were just making up information, sometimes they were underreporting. So actually, I found out that the truth about my grandmother was much more complicated to find, just because you couldn't really trust the way the archive produces information that would help you find the truth. And that's what, at some point in the process of writing the book, prompted me to shift from writing a non-fiction book that would track the truth of the archive to write a fictionalized account of my grandmother's life that would also be able to talk about the lies of the archive.
That's a very interesting point, because I feel throughout your book there is the question of the essence. Like, what is a person? What makes a person a person? Is your grandmother the grandmother that you used to know, or is your new person through the archives and the documents? And you would assume that documents of our archive are so reliable that they bring up new information, but instead they blur it even more. And there is it's very in the beginning, in Saloniki even, there's a huge, you describe the different ethnics and the different people, and already there your grandmother is asked, who are you? Could you maybe tell us more about this city where your grandmother is born, and how it influenced her identity, and maybe also yours?
Yeah, so at one level, identity is about just documents, right? So which office you go to be registered, what passport you hold, what is said in your birth certificate about which year you were born in and which city you were born to, and so on. And in another way, for people like my grandmother who have lived through shifting political systems, identity is not really a place or a record in a piece of paper. It's actually a time that often is completely lost to us. So this problem with the archives that I started thinking about when I was doing the surveillance reports in Albania, I thought, well, maybe this is the communist archives and there's an authoritarian system there that is concealing information or you can't trust it. And so I went to Greece where she was born. She was born in Saloniki in 1918, just immediately before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, although Saloniki was already a Greek city then. And when I started doing her research about her life then, I was told first, I went to the archive and I said, I'm researching my grandmother, this woman who was born, and they said, woman? You can't find in the archives from 1918 women records, because in those times, women would be dependent on men, you know, uncles, husbands, brothers, and there were no legal records.
They're not important enough.
Well, they just didn't exist legally. So if your identity depends on a legal document and you're not really recognized as a legal subject, then you can't really find anything. So I said, okay, well, maybe I search her grandfather, who was an aristocrat, a kind of pasha in the Ottoman Empire. And I said, well, he was important. He had property, he had land. So there must be something in the cadastre, and you research what you can find. And I was told, well, when was this? And I said, well, this was during the Ottoman Empire. And they said, no, Ottoman Empire. This is modern Greece. This is an archive of modern Greece. We can't give you information. So actually, this question of identity is a question that you can raise, as I say, legally and politically. And for that, you take what you are given by the authorities of the time. They tell you that she was born in Thessaloniki, and Thessaloniki was a Greek city. Or you can take it historically and philosophically, and you discover that the answer is much more complicated, because these identities, especially these imperial identities, are very fragmented, very fluid, not overlapping with any of the boundaries that we know now politically. And so this question of who are you, which at some point in her life became really important, it became important because her old identity, which was the imperial Ottoman identity, was destroyed by history and by the shifting forces of the time.
Yeah. So there is, like you mentioned, why you kind of wrote parts in a fictional way. I was wondering, had you ever have the thought just to write a novel from the story of your grandmother? Because there's so many blurred information, so many insecurities, so many philosophical questions that you raise. It would also have been great material for a novel, no?
Yeah, I wanted, though, to, in part through the form of the book, question this confusion between what is reality and what is artifice, right? And so if you write a novel is fiction, and people take it to be a lie, and everyone doesn't really think there is a connection to truth there. So they think this is just an author who is imagining stuff. If you write non-fiction, everyone assumes this is the truth, and so the author is actually just saying what they found. And I wanted to convey in the book and in the form of the book the same confusion that I experienced in the archive, which was you go there thinking that you'll find the truth, and what you find is the aesthetic creation of an archivist or a surveillance or a spy or some authority. So they've put together this document, and it's a work of art of sorts. So the archive has its own aesthetic in a way. And then on the other hand, I thought, okay, so how do I then include all those silences or all those voices of the archive that I can only find fragments of, but don't really necessarily come to cohere in one person? And I thought, well, this is what literature does. It takes kind of fragments of lives and fragments of history, and by putting them in character and in plot, can give you a picture not of the people at the time, or of the real people, but of the forces that made those people pick certain choices and do certain things and go in certain places. And so you can kind of reconstruct the psychology and the historical circumstances and the moral dilemmas. And literature there, I think, aspires to a kind of truth, because it's still trying to reconstruct the context and it's still trying to reckon with historical forces, but it does it in the form of a lie, whereas the archive aspires to also truth, but actually is just ideology and just propaganda. And so it's, in some ways, I think there is more truth to the lies of literature than there is to the lies of the archive. And so this is what made me want to write the book in a hybrid form, where I would work with the documents that I found, and so a lot of the book chapters are just their surveillance reports as I was reading them, as I was finding them, as I was completely confused by them, and then imagine what I couldn't find with the help of other historical records, other, diaries of the period, or survivor letters, or diplomatic documents, and put together a literary form book, but also with historical records that were not about my grandmother. And I think this story that is told in both ways is there because I think maybe there is a kind of truth that comes from both of these perspectives put together, rather than just picking one of them and thinking that this is what it is. I think there's much more ambiguity and there's much more nuance as a result.
A storyline that I found very compelling and interesting was not of political nature, but it was like the first big tragedy in the book is about the aunt of your grandmother Selma and this German salesman Gustav Heim. Why did you empathize the story so much, and which meaning does it have in the end for even the biography of your grandmother?
Yeah. So the story is there in part to talk about what brought to, as I said, at some point I gave up on the truth of my grandmother's life, and I decided to reconstruct the truth of the historical forces that led to the ruin of that life. So I realized I couldn't really capture the life, but I could capture the historical movements and the shifts that had somehow changed it. And in Saloniki in the 1920s, there were two things that were really important, in particular when it came to my family, but also more generally for a lot of well-to-do families of that kind with these shifting mixed identities. They were Albanians, but they were born in Saloniki. They were connected to the Ottoman elites. One was the population exchange between Greece and Turkey that was established at the end of the Ottoman Empire after a treaty that was called the Lausanne Treaty that forced all the Greeks of Asia Minor to move to Saloniki and all the Turks of Saloniki to go to Greece, and all the other groups like Albanians, Armenians, Bulgarians also had to kind of pick which of these ways would they be swapped. So that was a real impact for my family, or for my grandmother's family, because this also affected their property and their wealth. And so with people, there were also movements of land, and so this affected their finances. And the other thing was the Wall Street crash, so the financial crash of 1929. And of course, the end of World War I, and this German businessman who came was also the result of a kind of German history after World War I, which was the Versailles. You know, he came with all his humiliation, looking for business opportunities in Saloniki. There had been a really important trade tobacco route between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, which was destroyed by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which took me months and months to research to try and reconstruct these trade links in the tobacco trade. So he came, and as a result of this encounter between this woman from this fallen aristocratic family and this German businessman who was a proto-Nazi, and but I mean not a Nazi in the way in which you imagine now Nazis. This was someone, a Nazi in the 1920s was a very different thing from a Nazi of how we think of them now. It was someone who was resentful, who was angry because Germany had lost the war, who was, he didn't necessarily hate the Jews, but he just thought they were taking business opportunities for him. So this was a way of reconstructing the rise of anti-Semitism and this 1920s and 1930s crisis that then led to the war and to whatever the tragedies that happened after.
He even offers, like your aunt makes suicide because she does not want to marry this German businessman, and so your grandmother seems to hate him in a way, and in the end, still he offers her help. Like you don't draw him as the typical evil Nazi. He still tries to help your grandmother. And she says, like, she refuses his help. Is this a try to keep dignity, or?
Yeah, I think the book is, I mean, so a lot of the book is about history and so these historical forces that shift in the 20th century, but a lot of it is also a philosophical effort to understand what does dignity mean in different circumstances by different people in different historical contexts. And so my grandmother has a kind of Kantian view of dignity, which is about, you know, you try and do the right thing and you follow moral principles, and that is what gives you dignity. He has a much more Nietzschean view of dignity, which is, you know, morality is all the result of power relations. But somehow a part of me as an author doesn't want to give up on the humanity of anyone. And sometimes also very, very terrible things are done by people who aren't necessarily terrible people in terrible circumstances. So I don't think there is a sort of fixity of human nature that means that, you know, bad people always do bad things and good people always do good things. I think part of the work of literature is to show you also the complexity of human nature in these choices. And this is why at the end I have this German character who offers her help, because there is a kind of morality even in someone who is a Nietzschean and a Nazi. And he won't call it morality. There's a long conversation between them on what is dignity. And he keeps refusing to call it dignity because he doesn't believe that there is anything like dignity. But somehow he still does something that is a form of trying to redeem himself. And I think in the book there's a lot of characters, each of which has different conceptions of dignity and different ways of unpacking what dignity means.
Did your research in the archives and like even writing this book and like the question of dignity, of like keeping dignity, did it change your perspective of the present and the understanding of our current events?
Yeah, I think it made me doubt the fact that actually it made me doubt the integrity of the present in a way in which I had started reading the book and thinking there is a kind of moral standpoint whereby we think the present is morally superior to the past, and we think that we now live at a time where we are superior to whatever happened in the past. And in the book, the more I was studying the interwar period, the more I realized these patterns that we now encounter in contemporary politics. So this was a time of rising nationalism, which then eventually deteriorated into full-blown fascism. It was a time of weaponizing of identity and minorities in the aftermath of the collapse of a kind of multicultural cosmopolitan setting. Again, much like what we go through now, where you see these debates around migration that weaponize identity and present that as the answer to the conflicts of the present. It was a time of deglobalization, so there had been global integration for a while and global trade and the League of Nations institutions that tried to somehow promote this integration. And eventually, as a result of the Wall Street crash, completely started to be undone. So you had tariff wars and trade wars and then arms race, which then led into full-blown war. So the more I studied the interwar period, the more I couldn't resist thinking about what everything I read seemed to have some parallel in the present. And this was in particular, you know, when Trump started announcing the trades and the tariffs. And I thought I had been reading about the tariffs in 1930 and how countries started first by putting tariffs on each other. And of course, this wasn't enough to solve the problem. So then they just go to war, because this ultra-nationalist competition and this idea that you make your country great again, it's not possible to make all countries great again at the same time. So they eventually just fight. And so I think it made me realize that actually, while I was reading the past and writing about the past with the idea of reconstructing the past, actually what it was telling me was much more something about the lies of the present, and made me, as I say, doubt the integrity from which I was thinking I had found a standpoint for reconstructing the past.
So it is always easier in the present to judge about the past. That's kind of what you said also. Like now we know what was bad and what was good, but like you yourself, you still have belief in the socialism and call yourself a socialist, though your family suffered from it and your grandfather was in prison. What still gives you trust in this belief system, even like right now when the left is really not socialistic in any way?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, in the book there's a character that's my grandfather, actually, who was a social democrat and a critic of capitalism, who went to prison under Stalinist Albania for 15 years and came out of prison still a social democrat and still a capitalist. And part of me really does not want that story to become a story, you know, the story of the left-wing victims of state socialism, to become a story of, well, therefore capitalism is superior. Because this man thought there was something to the critique of capitalism, and I think he was right to think that. He thought there was a problem with the Bolshevik way of resolving the problems of capitalism, and I think he was right about that. So I think there is something out of both of these engagements with history, one with Stalinism and the history of socialism in the 20th century, and one with capitalism and the failures and the history of capitalism in the 20th and 21st century. And I think it would be an injustice, and also somehow not really vindicating the dignity of all these dead people who died in the name of these ideals, to somehow assimilate their stories and their legacy to saying, well, therefore capitalism is great because state socialism failed, because they were themselves victims of state socialism. So what gives us the authority to then tell them, well, you were naive and you were stupid and you came out of prison and thought that there was something still problematic about capitalism? And I think where I'm trying to go with my work in both philosophy and political analysis is just opening this space for a belief system that just refuses to be assimilated by either one or the other, and instead raises questions of integrity and morality, which I think speak to all of us and which hopefully push all of us to want to change the world in which they live.
Well, it's not working so well right now. The left is pretty weak in Germany, at least. In Europe, we have like the right is on the rise. how, like, do you think the left is too shy about critique about capitalism because of old wounds?
I mean, I don't know that there is a left critique, actually, of capitalism still.
There is no, you would say.
No, because I think the critiques of the left are all membership-based critiques, so they are all identity critiques. So there are critiques that resolve the problems of globalization by saying the problems of globalization are problems of membership. If I can decide who belongs where, to which group, this will fix it somehow. And I think that is just not the answer that one should give to a conflict that is socioeconomic and political in nature. It's not about culture, it's not about, you know, religion, it's not about belonging, it's about trying to understand functional developments in society in a way that highlights the socioeconomic and political contradictions. If you don't have categories of analysis of the world that refuse to be assimilated to cultural analysis or to identity analysis, then of course the narrative is driven by the right because they're very good at pushing this identity critique. And if you don't have an alternative, completely different way of thinking about the world, then of course the right is hegemonic, because if people need to, when they decide to vote, who to vote for, they always go for the original rather than the bad copy. And so if the left kind of chases the right, thinking, well, I carry on talking about migration, for example, and fighting migration because people will trust me, well, they won't trust you because you haven't done it all your life, and you haven't done it consistently, and voters can spot cynicism and hypocrisy in politics. And therefore, those who are much more brutal but more authentic are much more likely to actually win.
So you kind of made a journey with this book through your family history, through politics. You raise a lot of very important questions in the book about like systems, belief systems, and the insecurities of the time. You already said like there are parallels between, but do you have like kind of a vision? Did you have like a thought that you would like that people who read this book take from your journey and from your studies or literature, whatever? It's all in this book.
I think so. I mean, it's more of a question, really. I think, and it's always for me the question of freedom, and somehow, and actually it's a question that's a very old philosophical question that starts with Socrates and keeps kind of being pushed and somehow never makes it. There's a reason why Socrates was killed by his fellow citizens, because although it's a very simple question, it's actually a very biting one. And it's the question of trying to think about authentic freedom and apparent freedom. So we all think we live in free societies that are, you know, superficially give opportunities, but actually we also live in a world that is not free for everyone. And I think a world that is not free for everyone is actually not free for anyone, because we all end up victims of the contradictions of this world that just doesn't work. So I think for me the takeaway question is really this fundamental question of freedom, which in this book in particular is connected to dignity, but much more generally this question of asking yourself, well, do you really live in a free society, and can you actually change, and what can you do from your social position, from your social role, to try and fight the unfreedom that you may not perceive immediately on your own skin or in your own circumstances, but is definitely a big absence out there and something that calls for change.
That's, I would say, good closure. Warm applause for Lea Ypi again. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.